Great, welcome everyone to the Andrews Community Forest Committee meeting, November 25th. We'd like to acknowledge we have a quorum and also members of the public tonight. Would anyone like to be our timekeeper tonight? All right, thank you. How about a minute taker for tonight? It might be a big job this evening. Anyone from the minute taker? Brad?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you very much to you. Okay. We would like to formally and officially welcome Jim Cochran and Sam Pratt to our committee. Welcome to both of you. We're glad that you're here.
Glad to be here as well.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, we have the minutes from the October 28th meeting. Does anyone have any amendments to the October 28th meeting minutes?
Couple of questions. Well, there's a confusion in the minutes about who's going to be chairing this meeting and the next few meetings, and the answer is clear. I don't know if we just minute that in today's minutes, the arrangement, which is that Melissa's chairing tonight, then for the next 3 months, it'll be Case Rosenberg, and then back to Melissa.
Yeah, I think that's the easiest.
That's okay. Yeah, I could just go in the minutes for today. A couple of things. Actually, for you, Jim.
Yep.
What's minuted is that you are familiar with the Andrews Community Forest, and what I remember hearing was you said, well, no, you haven't really explored that.
Yeah, just 1 or 2 forays. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I thought was unclear about you, Jim, was whether you are a member of the Trails Committee. I think at one time you were, and you stated that, but it was unclear from the minutes, the way I read them, whether you are currently.
Currently, no, and I never have been. I was a member of the Conservation Commission for a number of years.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, but I've never been on the Trails Committee. I've interacted with them, fair enough, but yeah.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying. Yeah, the text I saw was, he said he has. He said he has spent time in the Andrews Forest and said he wouldn't be pigeonholed by being on the Richmond Trails Committee as well. That's what's in the minutes, which implies that Jim was.
Those were my notes, very good notes, trying to get things.
You correct those, or?
I'm happy to.
So, yeah, whatever it is, the wish of the meeting to change the minutes or note in the minutes that clarifications were made.
Okay. So we have a couple of clarifications. One who's co-chair this evening, and that Jim was a member of the Conservation Commission. Does that sound adequate?
Not a member of the Trails.
Not a member of the Trails.
Right.
Okay,
But representing.
all right. So do we have a motion to approve the amended, proposed amended minutes?
I move.
Right, and second?
Brian,
Oh, I move.
you move all second.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Bad ears. So
Great. Are there any additions or changes to the agenda? No? Okay. Great. How about, we don't have a report from the Trails Committee because Chase is not here this evening, but report from the Conservation Commission.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to report. I believe Biofinder is already on the agenda today.
Yes.
So we had discussed that some more. I guess we'll talk about that when we get to it in the agenda. Just a reminder that signups go until 12:15 for that. We did talk a little bit about flooding and flood mitigation in Richmond, which is sort of, we didn't really make any big decisions yet, but that could, I suppose, impact ACF down the line, depending on if some of the findings deem flood mitigation being necessary in ACF. But there's not a whole lot that we discussed, I think, that really pertains to ACF at this point in time. Although I will note that I noticed the select board's having a special flood mitigation meeting on the 3rd of December, which might end up affecting ACF to some degree, just because water flows through it. And it looks like engineers are going to be looking at Richmond on the whole. So it'll be interesting to see. So that sort of dovetails a little bit with what RCC has been talking about, but we didn't really discuss that because I noticed that meeting after. But if we end up discussing it, I'll keep you posted.
Great,
That's all I
thank
got.
you.
Yep.
Thanks. Okay, so our next agenda item is,
Could we have, should we have introductions with the public? Is that usually done at the beginning?
I don't know that-
Taker wants to be able to.
I think that we record the names of the public. I'm not
Okay,
sure that we
so
introduce every single.
Could we go
person.
down the list so I can? So. you could-
Yeah, do you wanna do
We
like
need just first and
Just
last name.
your first,
Merrick Gillies?
I'm sorry, what was?
Merrick, Merrick. And then Gillies is my last name, Gillies.
ICFIES,
IES.
great, thank you.
Well,
Okay,
Jeanette Malone, I'm with the RCC.
okay.
Dan Wilson,
Danielson. Okay, and,
Max Krieger.
great, thanks, guys.
You got two, one-on-one.
Oh, yeah, and see, Nancy is on.
Is enough sign-in sheets?
Okay,
No, we never have. Maybe we should.
So I usually do, yeah.
good idea. Okay,
Okay, great. Well, I would like to introduce to you our town zoning administrator who's going to be speaking with us this evening. And the way we're going to run this is,
can I just interrupt for a second? It looks like public comment is before.
oh, I'm so sorry,
zoning.
yeah. So we can do public comment. We have some time planned for after
Okay, I'm just,
the zoning, but if anybody has a public comment that is not related to tonight's discussion of zoning, public comment on anything other than zoning, which we're about to talk about. We could do that now.
And one quick thing, is Biofinder on the agenda?
Yes,
It
it is.
is.
I'll take my comment.
Anyone else before we dive in? Okay. So tonight we have a good amount of time for zoning discussion. And I'd like to introduce our town zoning administrator, Tyler Machia. We're gonna give the floor to Tyler for a presentation. And the way we'll run this is I will ask everyone to hold their questions until the end of Tyler's presentation. Then we will have a round of questions for committee members. And I ask that you ask one question and let someone else ask a question before you ask multiple questions. And then we'll have rounds of questions for members of the public. And the reason we're doing it this way this evening is so that everybody's questions can be answered and everyone has a chance to speak who would like to. So being mindful of the time, we'll make sure that everybody has a chance to ask at least one question this evening, probably more. I'm sure you have many, as do I. And hopefully everybody got a chance to read the memo from Tyler Machia that would help introduce this topic to you, but I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Tyler.
Thank you. So before I get into the memo, I guess we could talk about kind of what prompted, this is that, I'm aware somewhat tangentially of some of the work that's been going on over the number of years with the Andrews Community Forest property and some of the history about that you know, some of the issues that the committee has had internally, some of the issues that they've had with the select board. And what prompted me to kind of try and get more involved in this is that I would like to try and help perhaps steer the conversation in a particular direction to make it easier for you guys to find some deliverables. So that way, I think people can feel that they're making progress on something. And I don't, being cognizant of the fact that you are all volunteers, you're all putting a lot of your own blood, sweat and tears into this. And I want to make sure that's for things that you can actually, or that have a higher likelihood of getting permitted, as opposed to things that will be not necessarily impossible, although some of them are going to be impossible, but have you guys spend a lot of time and energy on things that when you get down to brass tacks are going to be very difficult to implement. And that way you guys can prioritize. I'm not gonna sit here and tell you, except where where I feel the regulations clearly say you can't, what you can or can't do with the property. That's not my place. That's this committee's conversation and a broader conversation between this committee and the select board and the town at large. It's not my role to tell you what to do with the property. All I'm trying to do is to explain how the process works and what will be expected of an applicant, regardless of who it is, to come before the development review board to do something similar to what you're doing. Another caveat to this is that our regulations are certainly not perfect. They don't envision all uses. I think this is probably one of them. My job as a zoning administrator, as frustrating as it is sometimes, is my job is to literally interpret the regulations, and that's spelled out in section 6.8.1. So sometimes it comes into conflict with what I personally like, or what sometimes common sense might seem to indicate, if it's in fact contradicted by the written regulations in there. So getting into kind of the meat and potatoes of this, I'll try to keep this very brief. I did write the memo. I did hope most of you got a chance to read it. But I'll kind of hit you through the greatest hits. So basically, we have to start off with, you know, what are trails kind of in Richmond. So we have trails in a nutshell are allowed in all districts. And that's spelled out in the sections that I referenced in the memo, specifically section 2.4.4. Unfortunately, there is not currently a definition for a trail or a recreational path in there. So then it leads one to, if I don't, how it typically works, like in zoning, if you don't have something that's defined in the regulations, you go to like a common source, like Merriam-Webster's dictionary, literally something like that. Which is what I did in this particular place. So like a trails or paths kind of clearly, you know, if you read the definition that I note in there, it clearly notes that these trails, recreational paths probably fall into the best in that category. And then it falls into the definition of land development. And because, and this is why are we having to have ACF go back to the Development Review Board to have their trail plan approved, is because outdoor recreation facilities, which is what Andrews Community Forest is currently permitted as, and that's through DRB, the DRB decision 2020-39, notes that trails are specifically called out in the site plan. And if you look at the site plan that was originally used to approve Andrews Community Forest, and submittals H and I have it here, H and I shows no trails located above the Velco power line. I'm assuming it's Velco that has that, right? There are some ag roads, that existing ag, like silviculture roads up there, and that it's noted in that decision, people were recreating on those, and that's fine. So because those site plan didn't initially show those trails, and that's a requirement in the initial approval of the Andrews Community Forest. And because you're expanding those trails, which is also expanding the pedestrian circulation patterns, which automatically trigger a major site plan review, which is noted in section 5.5.4. I do a lot of flipping. Let me see here. Quote you the exact text. is if you notice the definition of, it's actually, excuse me, it's 5.5.5. It notes the major and minor site plan amendments. So because it triggers that, that's why it has to go to the Development Review Board. Now, trails meet the definition of land development because it also, because of that expansion of use is what triggers land development per section 7 of the definitions. Section 7 has a definition of land development, which is in there, and it notes that changing the use of the land or expanding the use of the land. So if you're taking something that's like a field and putting a trail on it, or if you're having something that's a conditional use, which in this case, outdoor recreation is a conditional use. If you're expanding that use, that qualifies as land development. Now, that leads us to perhaps the more the sticky widget for you guys, which is the steep slopes. So section section 611 is what notes the regulations on steep slopes. And any land development, which again, these trails meet that definition of land development. You know, if your land development occurs on a slope of 20 or construction occurs on a slope of 20% or more, you're required to have professionally done ENS plans for erosion and sedimentation control. So what that means is you have to have a professional engineer design erosion control measures for those trails, particularly during the construction phase. It's more so for the construction phase. So such as like silt fencing, things like that. How are you going to mitigate water coming off of this? That also becomes more of a problem if you look earlier in the regulations, which is in section 2.4. There it is. 2.5.2, letter B, which notes slopes equal to or greater than 35%. They're prohibited from having land development. They're considered non-developable portions of the property. So where that becomes problematic is if you have a slope, if you look at the trail plan, at least as it was proposed, and I do apologize, I hope I used the right one. I was trying to get a little clarification on it. A lot of the trails and stuff on there, even the currently existing ones, are on slopes that are indicated, you know, greater to or less than 20%. There's very few, I don't think any that are under that. Again, now we're not going back and looking at stuff that's already permitted, that's been permitted, that's done, that was in the site plan. We're kind of moving forward. But anything that's on a slope of 35% or more, you can't build on that. So you would have to relocate those trails. And anything that's on a slope between 20 and 35% would have to have professionally done erosion and sedimentation plans. As far as who would put an application like this together, the Three Parks Committee is going through this right now for Browns Court and their proposal to put pickleball and other things up there. They're going through for site plan approval by the Development Review Board. Now, what's important to note about site plan approval, we're not looking at the use. Now, why does that matter? So is that the use of this area is outdoor, as an outdoor recreation facility. What that means is if people come in and oppose a project saying we don't want to have an outdoor recreation facility here, that's not the scope of what the DRB is looking at. It's been permitted. You guys aren't looking to change the use. The use is the use. The only thing we're looking at is you want to put trails on there. Trails have to meet the standards of site plan review as I've outlined, right? And those are all in 5.5, meaning that you have to have it prepared by a professional engineer, the plan set. You can request a waiver for that, except for the fact that there is no waiver for the erosion control section of it. So you could have a waiver for like a lot of the application materials. You might be able to use the Arrowwood report, which is pretty detailed. I haven't read it page to page, but I've read a good chunk of it. A lot of time and energy went into that. So you may be able to use that, request that the board use that in lieu of having it be prepared by a licensed professional engineer, landscape architect, et cetera. You could do that. And also, so we're only looking at, if you guys check the boxes, right? You get the trails. That's how that works. That's kind of how that works. We're not, the board doesn't say, we don't like this here. We look at, this is where you want to put it, right? Is it conflict with anything in the regulations, right? Is it on a slope that's too steep? Is it in large like animal habitat? Is it in a wetland? Is it in a place where, do you have these erosion control plans for it? Now, they can reject something because you don't have the plans for it, but they're not rejecting the trail. They were saying you don't have enough information to do what it is that you're trying to do. So essentially, you want to think of it as a large box checking exercise. If you've checked the boxes, on the back end, you get your approval. And that's kind of how the process works. I know I've thrown a lot at you. It might be more constructive for me to answer your questions, and I don't want to necessarily take 45 minutes to read my memo verbatim to you. So I'm happy to, I guess, to take any questions at the chair's discretion.
Okay, great. We'll open it up to questions for committee members. First, one round of questions for each person, and then we'll move on. Jim,
Curious if, other towns in the state of Vermont are viewing trails this way, or if this is.
That's a very good question, and I don't have a good answer to that. How it's important to remember, and it's also hits on one of my recommendations in here, is that just because one town lets people do something doesn't mean that all towns do it. Each municipality is responsible for regulating land development inside of that municipality. There's some state overlaps, there's some overarching state guidelines with stuff like generally agriculture. There's things like that are exempt from local regulations because the state deals with that. I'm sure you're familiar with some of that. There's some Act 250 jurisdiction stuff as well.
I think all Act 250 is also.
Yeah, a lot of it's impacted by town.
There's no.
No, but they'll look at the town plans and things like that. So just because things have occurred a certain way, let's say in, Bolton or Underhill or Jericho, doesn't really have any bearing on Richmond. You have to look at Richmond specific regulations.
I'm
Now,
curious if there are any other towns that are looking at it this way.
that's a really good question. I don't know. And it's not something I looked at. I was looking at it more in the scope of what do our regulations allow? Because that's really my job. But I did note that if that is something that you guys might want to consider looking at, is having a broader conversation with the planning commission about if you want to do more trail building, be it Andrews Community Forest, be it your property as well, Jim. It might make sense to develop a trails as a use and kind of create regulations that more adequately fit what's there. Because I actually looked at Cochran's as an area to see how that had been permitted in the past. And because you guys were built in the 60s, it predates a lot of the zoning stuff like that. A lot of it did way
Yeah,
back in the day.
we've certainly had bike trails that have gone.
No,
since then.
Yeah, and again, I'm not here to, I know there's a lot of, and that's part of there's a lot of private trail networks around town, and I'm aware of that, and I'm not hiding in the bushes looking to running through the woods looking for
Look,
unpermitted trails.
there's a lot of public trails too. that
No, and that's,
Need to meet this requirement.
and they should have been permitted, and they hadn't been in the past, and that was, I think, through some things were just done. And they weren't necessarily really looked at from a permitting standpoint.
I know looking at our trails from a permitting standpoint, because some have gone through Act 250, the newer ones.
Mm.
This was never on my radar.
Yeah.
And I had many conversations with.
I saw a letter about Suzanne, I think about that, yeah,
Your predecessors.
absolutely. And
Sure.
part of this does come down to there is interpretation involved, right? And I may have a different interpretation, whether you like it, dislike it, that's fine, I understand. Of how the rules are read, because I do take the literally part literally, and I guess I'm a firm, if you want to, how do I approach administering rules and regs, is that I take it, this is what the town wanted, and it's my job to interpret it as it's there, and if there are changes that want to be made, perhaps my literal interpretation of it will prompt conversations as that, hey, this is what this actually says, rather than me trying to fix it in a way that I think makes sense. It's to help prompt a conversation like, hey, this isn't really working for us. We should really pursue that sort of change. It's part of how I approach my job.
Does this fit that category for you?
It's, again, I think it's not my place to say that. It's your guys' place to determine of whether or not you feel it meets your needs. And if it's not, then I would say that's a broader conversation to have with the planning commission. And I will happy to interpret it whatever they come up with.
That was like 4 questions.
Okay,
Sorry.
okay.
No, but it was good.
Okay, I'm gonna call Brad. Would you
I,
like
I
to ask-
was,
You may ask your question if you want.
I was just gonna help answer this question.
Well, no.
About other towns?
No, let's just wait. You can ask a question, you can ask a question right now. Of,
But I can't point out that,
no, I don't want you to jump in on other people's questions right now
Okay.
because it's gonna really slow down the process
All right,
of
let me
people being
think
able
about
to
this.
ask a question.
okay,
I'm sure we could skip and come back.
Yeah, if we have time, we'll definitely, we'll come back to that, but.
Okay.
Would you like to ask a question now or just?
well, let me think one.
Does that, someone else have a question that they'd like to ask?
Sure.
Ian,
Thanks, Tyler, for pointing out a factor that we were really not aware of, I think previously, the importance of slopes, and I'm pressing the slopes issue. And the question really is how to measure the slope.
Right.
Well, I'm sure surveyors know how to do it, but I think in the process of deciding which trail system and which trails we're most interested in pursuing, we want to be able to look at a map as you have and point to trails that looks.
So you're looking at basically like, you could look at your A&R and obviously like where this gets tricky, because again, and this is where I went back and forth a little bit, it's like if you go into like, say for site plan review, right? And you want to try and not have a professional surveyor, you can use like the A&R stuff. There's some other things that you can look at, but it doesn't there's a certain lack of granularity that you kind of get with it. It's more intended for broad strokes, and they'll tell you this isn't in lieu of a professional survey. This is a broad stroke that there are things in this area. You could get in there and be very site specific, where there could be like a little gully or the little thing that you could perfectly suitable for putting in a trail, but you're not going to see it at the 500-foot level. You're going to have to really get down into there and just see all those all those little granularities. I hunt quite a bit, and I can tell you, like, you look at topo maps, then you get in there and all the little micro features and stuff that are inside of there is really interesting sometimes. And you might actually, in some cases, it might make it easier for you to build trails, because there could be maybe a little shelf or a little something there that's natural that has a much less, a less steep grade than another area. Because as a general rule, how I would interpret it is if it's on a slope, right? That's 20% or more, it needs ENS. Now, that being said, if you could show me that it's not 20, it's 19.5. 19.5 isn't 20. So that means you don't have to have professional ENS plans for that. Now, other features, like let's say if you need a footbridge or things like that, like those could still be permitted. Again, I think, these regs don't really, I was trying to find ways that you could do, what could you do? Like what things could you do? I think if you wanted to develop an easier thing to develop on slopes that are over 20%, 20 to 35, which wouldn't require ENS, is stuff that doesn't require construction, right? Now, that seems like a weird distinction to make there. So that's why I use that Webster's definition of construction, which is to make or form by combining or arranging parts and elements. And it specifically notes construct a bridge, right? So let's say hypothetically, you have an area that's got 20 to 35% slope. And you wanted to put a hiking trail up there that had no quote unquote construction involved, meaning you removed deadfall, right? And you just basically marked it, however, you painted trees or whatever, say here's a hiking path to a particular area. You could do that. It would still need a permit because it would still meet the definition of land development because it's a use. But because there's no construction involved, it wouldn't trigger the ENS part. However, if you needed to put in a footbridge, you needed to bank it, you needed to put in stuff to preserve the bank, that's where we kind of cross into that constructing end of it, which would trigger that professional ENS stuff. So I'm trying to kind of give you guys some options where you might be able to put in, maybe you can't put in, let's say, a mountain biking trail or an out, but maybe you could put a hiking trail in a certain spot, which might be easier for you guys to do. Maybe just to kind of give you guys some food for thought as to different options that you can explore if there's a real desire to get to a particular geographic feature. that may be problematic from a construction standpoint, but if there's no construction, might be less of a challenge for you. Just some things to consider. So I hope that answered the question.
Well, yeah, if I could just get clear about this. I understand slope is defined in the same way as roofs. And
Yeah, rise over run.
it's like on staircases, it's riser divided by run. So there has to be a basis for the run. You know, which could be a foot or it could be.
Yeah, I really would have to probably defer to a professional for that.
Yeah, the surveyors know how to do it, but just to help us know what we're getting into, we've looked at state maps, which I believe are based on LiDAR imaging, which is very spatially precise. And fortunately, well, there seem to be different versions of it online, but one of them anyway is color coded and the thresholds of 20% and 35% very conveniently for us. So just so we can sort of know what we're getting into, those state maps would be a reasonable place.
Yeah, and that's fine. Again, that's gonna get you started. Again, that's not to be in lieu of a professional survey.
Sure.
Right, but that being said, that's where there is the ability for the board to make certain waiver requests, and that's like I say, if you didn't want to have the entire plan engineered,
Sure.
right? Yeah, you could maybe use that, and this is the board, and it's the board's call, right? Yeah, it's important to remember when we go to the development review board, I do prepare staff notes for every board meeting, and I do make recommendations, but they're exactly that, they're recommendations. The development review board can accept my recommendations, they can ignore them, they can accept some and not others. It's their ball game. Once it gets there, it's just what my notes are intended to do is to point out where I think there are problems in the regulations between what an applicant submitted and what we need. And I'll point those out and make recommendations accordingly, but that's ultimately the board's decision, what they choose to do with that.
Good.
Okay, next question. Sam?
So I have a question about, it sort of pertains to the erosion. So I was looking through your note and then I also referenced the, like the zoning regs and also the Richmond town plan and noticed that the town plan does talk about the different tiers of slope and what you can and can't develop on. What I noticed also in the town plan, but not in the zoning regs, was development being restricted on ridge lines over 900 feet.
Yeah, so here's an important thing and this is a little bit of a crash course in kind of zoning and planning.
Okay.
Right? So planning is an aspirational document.
Okay.
It has, aside from Act 250, like really doesn't have much teeth in terms of like what's in there.
Okay.
The zoning regs are supposed to be how you implement the town plan.
Okay.
Oftentimes the plan's here, the zoning regs are here, and they're always trying to catch up. Actually, as we're just starting that process, we are now in the process of starting to make changes or renew our town plan, which we're required to do, I think, every 8 years. Used to be every 5, if my memory serves. I could be wrong on that. So just because there's something, I don't, for example, reference the town plan at all when I do my job. The only thing I look at is right here, because this is what's legally binding. This is what I can hold people to. The plan is things that we would like to do, and this is supposed to talk to the plan. Again, does that to varying degrees of success. But that's essentially how that process works.
Okay, so because it's not in the zoning regs, it doesn't matter.
I
So
wouldn't
you
look
could-
at that, no.
Okay.
I would look at, again, if it's over 35% slope, you can't build on it, that's pretty clear. Now granted, that doesn't mean you can't make it less than 35, right? If you wanna, let's say, blast in a shelf area where to lower the grade, you could do that. I've had people do that. But that's that's one of those, if you're trying to, that's one of those more a little bit trickier thing in the regs, but that's generally how it is. Like for example, like a home, like you couldn't build a home on 35% grade. You'd have to make it less. Again,
Okay.
trails, but again, if something meets that definition of land development, I treat it the same, whether it's, a trail, a shed, a house, regardless of whether or not that necessarily intuitively makes sense. That's how I have to kind of do it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, because the only thing I see in the regs is with regards to like telecommunication, like stealth facilities at or above.
Yeah, those wouldn't apply, because that's not what you're trying to, that's not what you're trying to build. Again,
Yeah,
that's not the use of that.
Okay,
particular- it is complicated, don't, like I said, it's, trust me, it took me quite a while to read through. Just to try and get my head around ACF, and it's a lot.
Cool, thank you.
No, my pleasure.
Okay, would you like to go?
Yeah, real quick one. When we talk about trails, and in the memo, you refer to hiking trails.
Mhm.
I mean, does whether it's hiking, biking, skiing, snowshoeing, does that come into play? 'Cause
They are all considered land development per the definition that I laid out in there. However, I did try and make a distinction between construction and trails that will require construction and trails that are more, how should we say, natural? Meaning that, okay, rather than me coming in here and like creating a terrace or putting in steps or doing things, it's a path that only thing we're doing is taking deadfall and moving it out of the way and marking it. Right now, granted, maybe that's not, I am by no means a trail building expert. I'm not gonna sit here and say if that's best practices for building trails. I merely meant to offer this as potentially an option that we could look at as a way, if there is a desire to access particular parts of the property that are challenging from a slope standpoint and may be very difficult to develop ENS plans for, as a way for you to get something. Right, so that way there's a feeling that there's some progress, because again, if you don't have that professional ENS requirement, that simplifies things. You could potentially get a waiver. You don't have to give it, but you could apply for a waiver from having the plans prepared by a professional licensed engineer. You might be able to use your Arrowwood report. You might have an easier time of getting those, something like that permitted, than having to go sit and go through, you know, ENS plans for every single little thing. They are still considered land development, regardless of whether it's for a mountain bike trail or a footpath.
So basically, you weren't restricting that comment to hiking alone.
No,
I did basically.
I'm trying to say, if it involves like people putting shovels in the ground and building features,
Right.
now we're in that construction
Okay.
thing. If we're just walking down the path, or if we're just, hey, they're just taking these dead logs or whatever, getting it out of the way and marking an area for people to walk,
Gotcha.
that's different.
Thank you.
What if they were existing, so the logging trails and roads that
Yep.
were already in there?
You can use those.
And the SC folks who came in and did our mapping said for various reasons, many of them are erosion control, we shouldn't be using them, we should be properly building trails. But you're saying that it wouldn't be a violation.
No.
To mark those and just let people, I mean.
I would not interpret that, those are already existing, you can maintain those, you can mow the grass on them. Again, because they're exempt from zoning, they're agriculture, silviculture trails.
Could I do a follow-up?
Sure, I'm gonna tag on to that though.
Okay, so this was agriculture and forestry before it was rezoned for recreation.
That's correct, yes.
If it had stayed in agriculture and forestry, could we have recreational activity on it? It seems like
No,
that's
because
permitted
once you
on-
cross that threshold, and again, you would, if to change it,
Yeah,
you'd have to go back through the process of
Right.
getting, that would raise the ability for people to object to, do we want to switch this to ag or do we not?
right. No, but I'm just curious, and it goes to that other question of what's going on in other communities, like maybe they just kept it in.
Yeah, so anything anything that exists like that, so agriculture, or in this case, silviculture. Like sure, if you have a forestry management plan or things like that, if you want to utilize those skid roads. I'm fine with that, because again, I think the purpose of this is for silviculture. If other things happen to occur on it. And you have, you know, a forestry management plan in place, again, I'm not hiding in the woods to, you know, ticketing people for. Walking down a skid road, right? That's not something that we can do, but the question is what is the purpose of this, right? The logging that's occurring is secondary to the principal use of the property, which is outdoor recreation. So again, if you want to put some skid roads, if you want people to recreate on skid roads that are there for forestry purposes, I think that's fine. The issue I think would be, and I know it's a weird perhaps distinction to make, but I don't have jurisdiction over
Right.
logging roads.
But if we could make an argument to the Development Review Board, I realize you're giving us a good faith interpretation of what's going on here, but in sort of trail building world, which I'm not currently part of, but I used to be. There's best practices for erosion, and you wouldn't just put people on skid trails, and it would actually be the more responsible thing to have properly built trails.
And I'm not disputing that, and again, that's not my area of
Right.
expertise, I'm just trying to give you options of what you
Right.
could do on the property
But-
per our regulation.
Yeah, but I'm just wondering if that would help us in an argument with the Development Review.
Not really, because again, you're looking at
If we do
this.
what's legal, it's actually worse for the environment than if we do it.
And this is where it's counterintuitive, right? I'm not looking at that. All I'm looking at is this particular book right here and what does or does it not let you do. And again, this might speak to the fact of maybe it might be a good idea for the committee to consider reaching out to the planning commission and having that conversation over trail building. Because clearly we all know there's trails in Richmond, right? Private, public, and otherwise. And perhaps there's a better way that we could be doing this that would, preserve, meet more people's goals, be it putting in more trails for recreation and preserving sensitive wildlife areas and streamlining it from a permitting standpoint. Because it's difficult for me to figure out what is it, right? Because there's other things I don't want it to necessarily be, which would make it even more difficult, like is a trail structure, right? Our definition of Richmond and trails is an assemblage of material intended for occupancy or use. So it's pretty broad. You take two rocks and stack them on top of each other in Richmond, you got yourself a structure. You could interpret it that way. And again, it's my job to interpret it literally. That's spelled out in the regulations. So that's where it's frustrating sometimes from my standpoint, because there's the common sense, what I would like to do. And then there's well, this is what it actually says. And if I read this literally and being honest about it, this is what this says. So therefore I have to do it this way, which is neither here nor there. That's the joys of being a zoning administrator sometimes.
Right, you had a follow-up.
Right, I think you're next, and then we're gonna be moving to public questions
Right.
in a few minutes.
So if we made the decision to seek approval to upgrade a logging road from a grown over logging road to a multi-use trail and install more water bars and improve it. Is it still a logging road or is it now a new trail?
Not to take a dodge, but I would have to, this is where the devil's in the details, right? I'd have to see the plan
Yeah,
for what it is that you want to do. As a general rule, this isn't why, if you ever happen to call my office, this is a PSA. I try and avoid dealing in hypotheticals.
yeah,
Because it really does depend where you're trying to do it, what you're trying to do. I could have a conversation about it now and be like, yeah, that sounds right. But then when I actually see the plans and I actually read it, I come up with something different. That's why I really hesitate to do that, because I don't want to give people
that's fine.
false interpretations of it.
Yeah.
I would be willing to consider it, and certainly.
Right, okay.
And as a general answer, I will say is if what is going on that logging road now falls in that definition of silviculture, right? If you put more water bars in it and to preserve that logging road and people happen to recreate on it, Again, it's not really something I'm regulating because the purpose of this is for silviculture, right? Whereas if you're putting a trail, let's say all the way up to connect the Sip of Sunshine, that's 2 feet wide. That's not really, unless you're doing some really selective cutting, I don't really think that's gonna meet the definition of silviculture. Yeah, well, even that, yeah, I think it would be, you're going up, taking one piece down at artisanal firewood harvesting or something.
Okay, we have just a couple minutes left for if there's any lightning last
Keep going a
question.
little longer,
from-
it's fine.
Okay.
I'm already.
I see I have 6 members of the public ready to ask questions, so I just need to make sure we get time in for that. Is there a lightning last question from anyone on the committee? Their follow-up, Sam?
You had just mentioned one of the reasons why a trail might not be allowed being an animal habitat. Could you expound on that just a little bit?
So again, there's certain call, and again, I have to find it, and there's certain like state prohibitions on where you can't develop in like deer wintering areas or things like that. There's also some hard calls for wetlands or wetland buffers.
Okay,
You can't develop within a wetland buffer unless you have a state permit for doing that, things like
The
that.
state does allow trails through those.
And in
Just
that
have
case,
to be approved.
yeah, that's one of those things, and then we're kind of in that. And again, there is some novelty to this, it might take a little bit of. Probably me spending a couple hours trying to figure out, does this or doesn't. It trigger something that we can and can't do, and that's. That's part of the, how the sausage kind of gets made in the zoning world, this. Trying to figure out what is a trail, I spend an inordinate amount of time on that, both myself and the planning director, trying to figure out what is it? And it's not. I have something that's there. Now, to be fair, there is some zoning changes that are coming through right now that aren't directly related to trails, but have potentially impact on trails. Some of that changes in the flood hazard overlay district would actually offer a definition of of a recreational path. But it depending, I haven't seen the final version of it. I've seen one version where it would meet my definition of land development. I saw some where it wouldn't. So again, a lot of this could, if they make a change and all of a sudden it changes something, then we might have a different conversation. This is, a place in time as it's written today, to the best of my knowledge, that's what the memo was based on.
okay,
All
so,
subject to change.
so that, isn't gonna be in the zoning regs, it would be potentially in some state documentation, and it would be up to you.
It
to
would be,
decide.
so yeah, there's certain call outs in there that I have to require, like certain state permitting in our I don't have jurisdiction over it, like the state has like wastewater permits. I
Yeah,
don't have jurisdiction over wastewater permit. But before I issue a zoning permit, I can require you to give me a wastewater permit.
okay, so,
I have nothing involved into whether or not I think they should issue you one.
sure,
They issue you one, I can require you give it to me, but other than that, that's it.
so if I looked up animal habitat zoning.
Deer
on the
winning,
state
yeah, deer,
website-
you'd look up like deer wintering areas or like something
Okay.
like that, and see what those regulations are.
Okay,
And it's an important and somewhat maddening distinction, right? Just because you get a local permit for something does not mean you have a state permit. And vice versa, just because you have a state permit doesn't mean you have a local approval to do something.
okay, cool.
You have to have both, and they are unfortunately, for better or worse, siloed processes. They do not talk to each other, despite the fact that maybe they should. That's a different
But
conversation.
sometimes require each other.
Yes, they do. I cannot tell you how many times I have had how should we say, a particular development that was required to make landscaping changes as a result of getting a state permit, which required them to come back to the board to amend their local permit. And then the board required additional amendment, which was different from the state amendment. So then they had to go back to, that's not a joke, that happens. And if you talk to developers across the state and across municipalities, that is a not uncommon story, unfortunately.
Okay, Tyler, can we turn towards questions from the public?
I'm here at your pleasure.
Okay,
As
great.
many
Would
as
you,
you'd like.
you have a question?
Sure, thank you. I read this memo a year ago, and I provided some comment to the committee, and I think
I did update it since then.
Right, I don't know if I saw that one, so I'd love to see that one at
Yeah.
some point. Anyways, I think where I was most confused, and maybe it's in your most recent memo, is that this whole concept of trails being considered land developed, I feel like is really the lynch. And if we wanna consider that in terms of, there's a lot of like extension of use and all these other things we've been talking about. That I think do play a large factor in how things might relate to the parcel, but. Speaking like sort of the town as a whole, I really do think that's sort of the most critical piece. And my question, I guess, is because there's no definitions, because we don't really have an idea. That's where I feel like I've in the past sort of looked to sort of see how other places, and I understand that the town doesn't necessarily, it's.
I can't do that.
I understand, but I do think that's important to consider when we're talking about it sort of in the overall structure, and I agree that maybe it's something for the additional, for the planning commission to look at, but I don't really think that based on our current regs, we view trails as land development, and I'm happy to elaborate that further, but I just we'd love to take a further look at that, because I think we went through a lot of, nuance between what constitutes trail, what doesn't, and structures and sort of different management practices of building, and there's been a lot of this work done around the state and a lot of different documentation and court cases for various cases, I think could inform our current reading of the regs and then potentially additional future readings of the regs if we do revise them.
Yeah.
So I would hate to see a situation where this committee is not able to perform actions due to the current reading of the regs, because I think we could have a different interpretation of those as they currently are written, and probably work to a future iteration where the regs could better inform how we potentially want to do things as a town with county input.
So I guess is, not to be, so what specifically is the question, is like, how do I define land development?
I guess so. We didn't really have like a
Watch
public comment period. I know we're like in question, so I was using that as my public comment. I think that I have enough questions and we don't have enough time that I would like everyone else to speak, so I want to just provide some. I'm happy to follow up as appropriate, but I want to make sure everyone gets a chance to talk. So I guess I don't have a question for you to answer directly. I'd love to see the updated memo. I don't think I clicked on it in the
It's on
materials.
the website,
Perfect.
in the
It
packet.
did come out Friday, so it took me a while to kind of like, I really wanted to make
No
sure.
problem. Yeah, I'll take.
I went through it, yeah. So basically what it is if you read in our section 7 is really where we kind of start this.
Sure, and I'm happy to read that after, just so other people can go now, just because, and sort of, take a closer.
Yeah, I guess if I can answer to just real quick your processing, so why, I don't look at court cases, right? The only thing I look at when I interpret our regulations is the regulations themselves, right? So I don't look at past, unless it's very limited case, like I would look at like past DRB decisions or past decisions of a zoning administrator in some respects. But essentially, it's my job to interpret it, so my interpretation is kind of what it is, for better, worse, or the otherwise. So just because it's a particular town or another town's interpret it one way doesn't necessarily bind me to do it. And I'm not trying to make it, to grandstand on to that point, I'm as fallible as the next person, but I do try and interpret our regs literally, as that's what I'm charged to do. So my answer to that is, if there is an issue with how I interpret them, I like change the rules, and I'll be more than happy to interpret them as they are written, because I'm not gonna sit here and tell you that they're perfect. They don't really encapsulate what you want to do, I think, particularly well, speaking personally, but it's not my job to pass that judgment. It's my job to read and interpret and leave it to the town at large and the planning commission and the select board to determine what regs they want to see, and then I enforce them to the best of my ability.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, yeah. Kit, would you like to comment or question?
Oh, wait a minute, and let somebody else.
Okay. Jeanette, do you have a question or a comment?
Sure. So I'm thinking about the implications as this committee is working on management plan revisions.
Mm.
And I'm curious where you would recommend we embed what we're learning from you in the management plan. Would it be under the topography section / geology, and along with that, maybe what are your recommendations about a simple explanation in this management plan about why slopes matter?
I would say slopes matter with the simplest, and not to take a dodge, is like trails will be built in conformance with the zoning regulations, and leave it at that. Again,
Obviously, there's something behind that.
well, yeah, I guess the question is, and that's not really my place to tell you how to write your management plan for your property, and it's not really my.
So that would
My
be their
wheelhouse.
interpretation.
Yeah, it's basically, the only thing that I am real, and I don't really have any comment on your management plan, other than that I am looking at solely, what is it that you want to build, right? That's all I deal with land development. So if you want to build trails up there, this is how you can potentially build trails. As to whether or not you should, what logging practices should you use, what types of uses do you want to allow on those trails? That's not for me to say, that's for this committee and the town at large to say. My job is to say, what do you want to build? What are you trying to do? Where are you trying to do it? How do we get it permitted? That's how I do it.
Thanks for answering that. And just to jump on that, my public comment would be is a recommendation that it does go in the topography section. Seems to make sense to go there. I haven't read in the most recent iteration. Mentioned, any of this new information that's coming forward.
Dan, do you have a question or comment?
Yeah, thanks for all the information, and I get that you're trying to help us out. So based on the zoning regulations, are there places where we can get some deliverables and have trails now? And I know that it's all related to the slope, but I don't totally understand, like, the slope is like this, but your trail is going across.
So if it is on a slope, and if the trail is on a land that has got that grade, it needs an ENS plan. Let's say if you had a trail in the field, right, or say you hypothetically flattened an area, I know that's not what you'd wanna do. And all of a sudden that grade went up from 20% to 10%, right? Not saying that's what you would wanna do, but just as a hypothetical. Then that trigger for the ENS goes away. Really, it's designed for like people putting in, let's say, like a driveway, like us on a slope that's a particular, that you need to have ENS plans in, stormwater stuff, things like that. You know, you may be able to get away with the trail with just silt fencing. Right? I'm not sure, I'm not a professional engineer, but it does say in here, as it's written today, I'm not saying it makes sense. But as it's written today, you need ENS plans.
Where can we? The trails?
You could put them on slopes that are between 20 and 35% with ENS plans. If they're under 20%, let's say 19% or 19.5, they don't need professional ENS plans. You can have them, get them permitted. They have to be approved by the development review board. But you don't necessarily need to have an ENS plan for them. You would just be able to show them on a site plan and have some way of verifying that the location, this is where you kind of get that.
Yeah.
Do you need a professional engineer or not?
If we want to get something like, there's a big appetite to get something.
Yeah.
So.
And that's in the my recommendation section.
You looked it over, where could we do stuff? Without having a lot of.
To be fair, a lot of the trail network as it's currently constructed would require it because it's on that slope of 20% or more, at least per the plans that I saw. Now, if you could find the areas where there aren't, and you want to build some trails. That's up, again, that's not my call to make. I'm not trying to tell you, here's where you could put trails. I'm just saying, if you want to put a trail on a particular slope that's that grade, this is what it needs.
So you said the existing trails already.
Well, those existing ones, yeah, those are fine. Your logging trails.
So we could fix up once we have.
Yeah, absolutely.
Get them better.
Yeah, absolutely.
Through this whole.
Yeah, you could clean them up right now. They exist. Yeah, absolutely. If you were to try and put some new structures in, like, so you want to put in a footbridge, but it's on an existing trail, I could, again, treading into that hypothetical territory here a little bit. I probably could permit that with just a zoning permit. Again, I'm not 100% on that, but I think that's a possibility. Again, the select board would have to approve it too, because the landowner has to sign off on an application. It can't be just this committee. It has to be the town or somebody from the town who owns the property is gonna have to sign off on it. Thank you.
Okay, Max, do you have a question or comment?
Yeah, may I comment and then question? Thank you very much for your time and in general. I guess broadly, my comments somewhat echo Merrick's in that, I guess to start from the beginning, there is clearly some interpretation occurring about the various definitions applying to trails and recreational paths. I agree that that seems to be kind of the starting key aspect is that definition. And there are myriad materials on a state level about that definition, including court cases, but also how the agency of natural resources and the Natural Resources Board, now land use review board treats those definitions. And there is also past precedent by prior zoning administrators about how trails are addressed. And it does seem that the definition that you employ using the dictionary does seem to contradict both the state interpretation and the prior zoning administration interpretation. And I recognize that it's your purview to do that. But I guess my question to you is, are you open to a change in that interpretation if sufficient evidence or information is presented to you indicating that the track you're taking, disagrees with past precedent and or may not be necessary. And I guess if I may add a second point on our question, because there's room for interpretation, it seems that in the memo presented that each section is interpreted, at least to me, to be in its most strict form. There is no definition of recreational trail in the zoning regs, and your interpretation is, I think, of the most strict form, which you stated tonight. If you rake a path through the woods, you need a zoning permit. And then if you go through your memo, your interpretation of public, or what is it, pedestrian circulation, is that if you have people walking through the woods, that impacts the pedestrian circulation of those woods. And typically pedestrian circulation is the term referred to for street and sidewalk planning, which I think we.
That conversation came up, actually.
Yeah, so there are myriad terms which are interpreted to me in the strictest sense. Is that your general practice as a zoning administrator is to, in every instance, interpret it to maximum, I would say, give the ZA the maximum purview over decisions, or is it to say the tie goes to the runner?
Right, so again,
Does that make sense?
so yeah, and if I can have to quote more regulations at you. But so this, where I kind of come to the approach that I come from, comes from section 8.1, which notes. The administrative officer shall administer these regulations literally and shall not have the power to permit any land development which is not in conformance with these zoning regulations. So that's kind of where my hands somewhat get tied. So it is supposed to be strict. It is supposed to be literal. So, granted, do I have some leeway? Now, here's the thing, if you're not land development, I could go another way and be stricter too, which is where, do you meet the definition of structure, which is an assembly of material intended for occupancy or use? So then I'm saying trails are structures. Which then that becomes a lot more problematic from a whole host of other reasons, right? So, okay, because I have to game this out, right? Okay, so if I say this is, a trail is a structure, then what point do I start requiring permits? You want to have a footpath down to your, to the river? Like, is that a trail? Is you walking in a particular area over and over again, creating a structure? Is it creating, or is there a distinction between you walking over and over in a particular area, different than you buying a whole bunch of SurePack, right? And putting in the trail, and putting down a particular paved area to a location, right? Because that's where I have to try and figure this out. And the way I interpreted it is in a way that kind of makes the rest of the regulations make sense. And how allows me to kind of interpret them in a way that kind of makes sense in a broader, functional standpoint. I agree with you that, and I'm certainly open to interpreting, meaning that if the planning commission comes around and says, Tyler, trails are no longer considered land development. They're no longer considered land development. That's what it is at that point. Or, hey, they just need a zoning permit, or hey, we don't need ENS plans for trails, right? That's where let's go.
Hey, Tyler, I have two more members of the public to get to, and then there's some more committee questions.
Yeah,
And I
absolutely.
think we have about 10 minutes of your time, so I'm gonna call on Kit.
So I do have a question now. Do the regulations, the zoning regulations do they incorporate for extreme climate change that because it's different?
The regulations are always playing catch up to the reality. So our regulations, again, I wouldn't say climate change is specifically called out in those regulations. How I tend to approach it is, again, what's literally written in there and say, what does an applicant need to do to get a permit? That's really what I look at.
Okay, and Nancy Zimney, did you have a question for Tyler or comment?
Nope, I'm good.
Okay, great. We'll circle back to committee, right?
Well, I just wanted to comment on the prior zoning administrator. You reminded me when you talked about circulation, we were looking to install a gate that people could walk around. But the fact that we were installing a gate could affect circulation. So your predecessor was reading the documents the same way in the proper and strict fashion, so you're not alone there.
Yeah, it is frustrating sometimes, because again, there's the common sense of what you would like to do, like Tyler, the person.
Right.
And then Tyler, the zoning administrator, has to read it a particular way, and oftentimes they are deciding one frustrates the other quite often, but it is what it is. And it's what I have to try and be cognizant of the fact is that these rules are written for a reason. This town, for whatever better or worse, has decided at some point that this is what they want. It's not my job to tell the town what they should want. And until such time that they change the regs to want something a certain way, I will interpret it as it's called out here to the best of my ability. Will I get it right all the time? No. Could somebody else read this and come to a completely different set of conclusions? Absolutely. But I'm here, and this is just the best that I can do based on my overall philosophy of how to do my job and based on the regulations as they are currently presented.
Cecilia has a question for you.
Yeah, is a deer stand considered a structure? And the second question is there a difference between extension of use and expansion of use?
I would say expansion. That's a good question. Again, I hesitate to entertain the hypothetical thing. I would say an extension or expansion, I would put them in the same category. At least they would seem to be doing similar things, because you're extending that use. You're taking a use where it currently doesn't exist, right? Let's say a trail network, and they're expanding this trail network into an area where it doesn't exist currently. That would be an extension of the use.
Yeah, because the zoning rules say extension of use, and if we decided to have, not mountain biking, what are those people that drop off of cliffs with?
Oh, base jumping?
Thinking, thank you, hang gliding.
That would fall in the definition of outdoor recreation.
Yeah, so that's recreation, that might be an expanding into other
You
areas,
see, but that's where I wouldn't,
but extending, but maybe just building more trails, we're not expanding into a new area.
well, I would say that those because again, what is the use? I would say the trails then is an outdoor recreation facility. Those trails are the facility that are facilitating the use, even though it's not what you would classically think of as a facility, which is like probably 4 walls and a roof, right? It's the same idea that this is there for people to recreate on, as opposed to somebody bushwhacking it through the woods to jump off of a cliff.
Well,
That's not really.
Trail.
No, but that's,
That's what I'm
again, the
talking
trail would be what the
Right.
person does on the trail.
Right.
We're not gonna get into that particularly. Is base jumping considered outdoor recreation or not? That's not something I would really get into.
And the deer stand, because we let people put up deer stands.
Deer stands, I would say outdoor recreation. I would say it's part of that, and again, it gets a little
But is it a
tricky.
structure?
I would say it's not really in my area to regulate because it's a hunting and fishing. Per our definitions, it's probably a structure. But again, and if it were in the woods, should a deer stand require a zoning permit? Per our definition, probably, but as a hunter myself, you'd be hard pressed to go, am I gonna go find somebody's deer stand that they hiked up and set in the woods? Most of the time, you're supposed to get, you are required to get landowner permission in most cases to install, in all cases to install a tree stand on somebody's property. From practical experience, there are a lot of tree stands that are in the woods all over the place that don't have anybody's permission. Especially if it's like an absentee landowner, like a logging company or something like that. Or area where I hunt has, it's 3,000 acres. There's tree stands and stuff all over the place up there. Some of them are marked, some of them aren't.
So we're allowed to allow people to put up deer stands.
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to, whether or not they should require a zoning permit. I'll burn that bridge when I get to it. I haven't had to get I may not have, I may lean on the fact I don't have jurisdiction over it because it's hunting and that's constitutionally protected. It's regulated by the state. So maybe that might be an out. I don't know. I've never had to consider it, to be honest with you.
We're 15 over, but it's a great discussion.
I'm fine. Again, this isn't the only meeting. I've made it, at least I caught the okay, more or less, to dedicate some more staff time to this, so I don't even mind popping in and just my goal is to help get you to the deliverable point, and I'm not trying to tell you what that is, that's not my job. But what I'm trying to do is to, how should we say, steer you more or make you aware of the potential challenges of doing something that may be very, controversial politically, and B, practically will be very difficult. And maybe more towards things that, you know, even while they may be difficult politically, from a practicality standpoint, in terms of the zoning regs, are easier to do. And to help give people a sense that you're making progress towards something. I'm not gonna tell you what that progress should look like. That's not my job, but it's to try and help. How should we say, diffuse situations which might have led to the past resignation of one of the chairs or something like that. That's what my goal is to try and help mitigate that as best that I can. And I think by explaining to people what the realities are of trying to do this from a permitting standpoint may help diffuse that. That's my hope.
Can I have one last?
Yes, go
question?
ahead. Yeah, we're gonna like run for 5 more minutes with this.
Okay.
So go ahead, Nicholas.
So it's clear we want to put trails in the 20 to 35 area where we've drawn lines. And that would require a permit and would require ENS, I'm assuming there's erosion and sedimentation plan by a
That's correct.
professional. So do you have a ballpark idea of what it would cost to do that?
I don't,
Is it $20,000 for the planning part?
I can't say that, and I don't make recommendations in terms of like contractors or things like that.
But something that would be, that you would approve, that you would look at it and say,
I would approve it if it meets those if I have professionally done ENS plans. How this works is that if I have something that's stamped by an engineer, I take it as gospel unless proven otherwise.
an engineer, my next door neighbor.
Engineer, planner, well, somebody who's professional certification, that carries some weight behind it.
Mhm.
And the reason that matters, if they put a stamp on it, right, and the facts aren't what they are, they can lose their professional license.
Right.
So they don't just stamp things just to stamp things. So that's why, as how I take that is if I have something from an engineer that says this is what this is and it's stamped, I take it as fact unless somebody can prove to me
Okay.
otherwise.
And these two people put their fingers up in the air when I said 20,000.
Oh,
Yeah,
Do you have any
Yeah,
ideas?
well, I know at the ski area, we have a rain garden. Which was part of the stormwater program, had to be designed by a professional engineer, the exact, and we've so far spent $30,000 on this, it's just a ditch. But the design,
The planning,
just not to build it, just the design.
and are you there? Do you already have your
No,
permit?
we are still not in compliance with that, it's been many.
Like a super long picture, you know?
No, there's
And
particular,
the reason it's expensive is because have a professional engineer do work, it is extremely expensive.
And so that's the
They
main
build-
cost.
which is why one of those,
That was only the design, we spent more than that, I mean, the actual building it, money, not a lot, not even close to that. But yeah, that type of design work it's, I mean, it's. I think for a project like this, it's probably a deal breaker, frankly, I don't know if you realize that, but.
no, and I, again, I'm not trying to, which is why if you read my recommendations, right, is that it might be a better conversation to have with the planning commission, and to be like, then let's get us, if we want to allow this, then let's flesh that out.
Question about that. Have there been other instances where that has happened, where you interpreted things a certain way? And the planning commission weighed in and said, well, we're not gonna look at it quite that strictly, we're gonna look at it more.
Well, they don't look at it, they interpret, they write rules, the only person who does the interpreting, not to be, again, not trying to make like an ego thing is me.
So when you say go back to the planning commission.
So for example, there's Volunteers Green
Yeah.
right now
Right.
and Brown's Court are kind of part of that, the changing the flood
Yeah,
hazard
you have
district
your-
regulations, yes.
You're interpreting it a certain way that will.
That's required, like I said, as a result of how it's, of what I think the regs say, you can't, which is, I think, pretty clear, you can't really do anything down there. So they're
Gotcha.
trying to change it to let that, let me move the playground, basically.
Right.
Cause right now I can't move it.
So the recreational committee is gonna go to the planning commission and say,
They're already done it. They've been having ongoing conversations. They've had a couple public comment periods on that.
gotcha, and the planning
Again.
commission would then sort of rewrite the regs.
Yes.
To allow you to then interpret things
Yes.
differently.
It, just to be honest with people, I note this in here and I understand that there's been years and months have gone into this and there's frustration with that pace and I totally understand that. It, regardless of which process you go down, it's a process that's gonna probably be measured in months. And I don't say that to be discouraging to people. I'm just saying that to just be honest and respectful of your time as volunteers. That, and to not get necessarily frustrated or throw up your hands with like, this is how it works, unfortunately. And it's frustrating for me from standpoint too, especially if not zoning Tyler has a particular, boy, it'd be cool to see this be done. I still have to be like, this is what it
I think
is.
that's.
One more question.
very-
No, please. Yeah,
Go ahead, Ian.
Oh, yes, well, maybe with that in mind. You have responsibilities and the DRB has responsibilities and you obviously work together. And so my question really, I don't want to bypass planning, the zoning administrator. But are there precedents, are there sort of informal arrangements by which a group such as this might approach the DRB for informal advice, or is that a no-no?
It's happened.
No, unfortunately, you have to go through me more or less. So like, again, the board doesn't deal in hypotheticals. And actually, if you were to do that, you kind of get in a breach of some ethics policies and ex parte communications. You really don't want to necessarily do
Well,
that.
we have noted a committee member has already done that, so we need to know what to do.
So I would say with that, and again, I think that it's not something that you would want to do. Now, typically, let's say if you've had communications with somebody about potentially wanting to do trails and that member is a board member, typically what we would try and do then, that person would disclose a conflict of interest. And they would have to make a determination as to whether or not they feel they can represent them, to be fair. And if they can't, they can recuse themselves. If they feel they can, they disclose it and continue on. Somebody can challenge that. And the board can vote whether or not a particular member has a conflict of interest or not, and vote that person, basically recused from hearing a particular issue. I have not had that happen. I'm not an expert on how that process would play out. I would really have to look at our rules and as to how that would work. As far as going around me to let's say like the select board or the planning commission, select board can't ignore its own regulations. So they can't turn around and say, no, we're gonna permit trails here, even if we want to. Like, it's the same thing with Volunteers Green, right? We own Volunteers Green, we own Brown's Court. Right, and you can't, just because the select board wants to do something and they say, yeah, we can do it, they still have to follow their regs. The only thing the town doesn't have to do is pay its zoning fees.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thanks.
And I have a question for
Yes.
you. So your recommendation around trying to get some easy deliverables under 20% slope.
Mhm.
How would that be measured? Who would have to measure that?
I
to
would-
say, in fact, this is under 20. Say we came and said, look, we made this.
How I would make that determination is how close are you? So like, if it's 10%, right, and I can look at it and there's not like,
Right.
you didn't just sit there and be like, hey, here we go, it's this shows that it's under.
If
20%.
18.5.
Yeah, I'd be like, yeah, that's a little too close. If it's 12, even if you're off by 5, I'm assuming you're not blatantly lying to me.
Right.
And I would want some documentation to like back that up, like, again, with your A&R, if you pulled up your A&R, your LiDAR, it shows that the risk grade it's 10% grade. I'm like, well, you need a professional,
Mhm.
if it's 10, I'm assuming the state's not off by 20%, right? It's more of that, if it's close enough, right? If
Okay,
it's 19.5, if it's
Okay.
18, you're like,
What if it is like micro terrain, the granularity?
well, then in that case, it would work the other way, right? If I saw something like, oh, this is 35%, there's no way, and I could get something from like an engineer or a professional that says, hey, this is actually like 18.5%. Again, you might be able to take that to the board and see whether or not they're okay with it. And if they're okay with it, I would probably say you don't need the ENS. However, if they're like, no, we're not, it would hit that ENS trigger. But if you had a professional engineer do it, you just skip right to that.
But if, let's say there was a gully
Mm,
that was 10 feet down, 10 feet across, 10 feet up.
it'd be tricky. Yeah,
Is that?
that might be one of those hypothetical. It's too particular for me.
There's no definition. You have nothing to fall back on. So how do we know whether to even come to you for that?
That's why I would like to, I'm trying to gonna make myself at least available, like, maybe not every meeting, but I got permission basically from Josh and Keith to spend more time and help, to try and help you get through
Seems like
that.
there has to be a definition at some point, right? So,
Well, I would say is like, I would look at it and be like, how would I interpret this as it is? And then based on this and see whether or not it's something that would meet that, I still think it would meet the definition of land development as it's written. 'cause
but
it's
I'm
extended
saying, is
use.
it over 35% or under 20 as it were?
Yeah, okay. I just don't know if I'm gonna be able to answer that just right now, Jen. I think it's something I would have to really look at.
I think
I'm not trying to dodge or anything. I guess I would need to see it, kind of like have it. This might be one of those ones I just have to have in front of me to really give you a good answer as to whether or not that makes sense. I think, again, if I'm trying to answer it, is I think if you can show me, like, if I have something that shows that there's this little micro, a feature in there, right? That is under a certain grade and that's where you want to run this. I'd be willing to see, think whether or not that would still need ENS or not. Again, it's just, I think I would just. I'm struggling to answer that basically, and I'm not trying to dodge,
Nice.
I'd be willing to look at it, if that helps at all.
Well, it was just,
Yeah, can I ask a question, just changing the track here a little bit, because it sounds like this one isn't gonna get answered right now. In your recommendations, you were talking about, or just that we could use an existing skid row,
Yep.
logging road, agricultural road,
Mhm.
as is, clear down trees, put up a sign.
Mhm.
Now, what if you take a shovel to that to make a berm?
If it's that part of that ag, if it's something that's used for the silviculture
Well, the
purposes.
berm would be for, let's say, the purpose of trail building to have a feature say.
I would say, and how I would deal with that is, and not to dodge, is I'm gonna lean very hard on that silviculture thing, right? Is if it's part of your forestry management plan,
Okay,
and this is logged, right? And you have, typically I would either look at RAPs or have something that's certified by like the state that says like, this is, you're doing agriculture, silviculture. Once you have that, I don't regulate it.
We have a forest management plan that covers the whole property by the county forester from the state.
Yeah.
And in that, he lists trails and roads, I mean, we have those. So does that mean we don't even get a permit?
If they are considered, what you would have to do in that instance, if it's a silviculture thing, you'd have to file. I typically do it as like a notice of intent to build, like notice of intent to build like a farm structure or something like that, and typically like ag roads. I don't typically permit like agricultural roads. How I've done it, and I'm trying to think of one, I deal mostly with farm stuff, like farm structures. The few times I've dealt with like logging operations, I basically wanted to see where the skid road was going. And as long as they had a forestry management plan from the state, they're doing forestry, type related activities.
Then we don't even get a permit.
You would probably notice if there's a structure, like if you had to put like a bridge over something, be like a notice of intent to build a farm structure is typically what it is. Like something like that, like.
Replace a culvert?
Replace a culvert will be under that ag exemption. Again, there's certain requirements that you have to do for agricultural roads and things like that. So it's not just completely do what you want. I've run into issues with that where people were replacing we're doing stuff under the guise of ag maintenance that really wasn't ag maintenance. So you'd have to really make sure you're in compliance with the state.
yeah, I know in the past, the zoning administrator in town definitely cared about the use. That was important.
Yeah, if it's being used for ag, it's ag. And again, if other uses are secondary to it, I think that's fine. I do think there's a distinction I would probably make between a logging road that people happen to bike down, and then if I go down and there's a bunch of kickers and like mountain bike features built onto a skid road, I'd be like, well, that's probably not, we're not in that forestry category anymore, if that kind of makes sense.
And for something under 20, just to be crystal clear, I think I heard you, is we do need a permit,
Yes,
if we're building.
and the select board would have to, the DRB would have to approve it.
And the DRB would approve it, and when a permit is given, it's the DRB that gives the permit, not you.
No, I issue the permit. The DRB approves me the plan for me to issue the permit. If that makes sense. The DRB doesn't issue permits. They give approvals for me to issue permits.
And is there ever a case where you do the permit without it going to the DRB?
Yes, it's in permitted uses, but because this use is a conditional use, it requires the DRB to review it, and because you're amending the site plan of a conditional use and it hits the trigger of a major site plan amendment, you have to go back for site plan approval to the development people.
But if it's below 20, we don't need the professional
No, you do not.
engineers, we could save a little money.
That's correct, yes.
And in our case, the applicant is
The town.
the town, and
So there's no permitting
through the
fees. from-
select
yeah.
board.
Right.
So typically how it's working, at least right now, I'm not trying to volunteer Duncan for this, but Duncan's preparing the application for, prepare for the Brown's Court currently. And that's actually gonna be on the DRB's agenda fairly soon, not this one, but probably in January.
And that's the rec committee.
That's the Three Parks Committee that's doing that.
Oh, you call
And
it that again?
Three Parks Committee.
3 parts.
So it is, and to be fair to them, there is, you know, it's been a process on their end as well. So it's not that, you guys are not certainly the only people that are town committee that is struggling with the zoning regulations in terms of doing things.
Okay, well, we have to move on to our other agenda items, but I want to thank you so much for giving us your time this evening. We really appreciate
Yeah,
it.
thank you,
And
Kelly.
we're looking forward to working with you further. It's wonderful that,
Yeah, and so I got kind of the green light. I might not be in person, but if I know enough about the meetings, I'm gonna try and. I got the green light to at least.
Great.
Show up, so if nothing else, I may be doing this from home and chiming in as
Okay.
needed, but I'd like to try and
help.
help get you guys going, get you guys in a position where you're. Feel like you're moving towards something. It might be way in the distance, but at least try and. Give you guys that, so that way you guys are feeling that your time is. You're not just spinning your wheels,
Right,
you're actually
right.
making progress towards something. Cause I think it would be really cool. I mean, you know, taking my zoning administrator hat off, you know, it's. You know, trail networks, you know, I live over in Morrisville, there's mountain biking trails all over the place. There's been a lot of stuff in Stowe, Katy Hill Forest, all that sort of stuff, so. You know, there's a lot of, and it's. You know, as the climate change, you may see those types of activities take. You know, more and more precedence on some mountain
How
streams
much of a
before.
long trail is over 35%?
Again, that's, I hear you, I hear you, like I said, and it's like. You know, trying to build, if you were to try and build your ski area today, we'd probably be having a tough conversation.
All right, well, thank you so much again, Tyler.
Yeah,
Appreciate it, and we're
Thank you, sir.
going to move on in our agenda now.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for coming.
Okay, next up, we have a very quick, update from,
That's not mine, it's,
very quick update from.
Oh, I got plenty of pen.
Oh,
so I'll steal somebody else's board.
thank you.
So I wanted to put the issue of biodiversity on the agenda in the hope that Julian would be here because he's been at the biodiversity, the committee, the conference of the parties UN sanctioned meeting in Cali, Colombia, which addressed the biodiversity, because the more recent one addressed climate change. But so he's not here. I will hear from him in due course. But I thought it was important just because it is relevant to the Andrews Forest. Maybe not directly in the big picture way that those people in Cali were trying to hash out a financial agreement. But we all recognize, I think, that the Andrews Forest has two very important roles that potentially relevant to biodiversity, and one is within the forest itself. There are natural communities which are threatened in many ways, and we don't want that to contribute to the loss of species, which of course is the huge impetus for having a biodiversity conference. The other reason is beyond the forest itself. We recognize that the Andrews Forest has a role as a kind of a corridor, a rather critical role between the Chittenden County uplands and the Winooski Valley and across the river. So it's a communication route, and that's I understand it's increasingly important as species migrate northwards, mostly from as the temperature and the ambient temperature and other conditions change. So that's why I wanted to have it on the agenda, and I hope we can take it up from Julian.
We'll hear from Julian next month.
Mhm.
Okay,
Go ahead.
I was just gonna comment that, I heard today from the county forester who's spoken to Ethan Tapper, the former county forester. I had asked him if he would consider, actually, the committee asked me to ask him a few meetings ago to, update our forestry plan, which is quite old. At least change a lot of future tenses to past tenses, because there are a lot of stuff in there that we will do, well, we have done it, you know, and dress it up. But anyway, I think climate change, that might be a nice mesh with what you're talking about. Because a lot of that forestry plan does, Ethan's old plan does factor in the effects on the trees, because we're gonna have a whole new species down the road. You know, beech are gonna, a lot of the maps is gonna be going up. Hemlock is threatened, that's gonna radically change things, so anyway, I think that might be another reason to have them up.
You've heard. Did you wanna?
Yeah, I was just wondering if it would be useful, maybe it's all old news to the community and the public, but to pair with the discussion from COP16. The Vermont, 30 by 30 proposal, and then the Chittenden Uplands, how ACF fits maybe in any of those three things. So that's nesting from the local to the state to the international. And would it be worth trying to put them, all three of those in, just briefly touching on them in the same meeting?
Mhm.
That makes sense?
Right now?
No, in the future when Julian can make.
Oh, what were the three local stated?
Well, like, Chittenden Uplands, I don't know if everybody's aware of that, and then,
What was the other thing you mentioned? COP16?
yeah, that's the biodiversity conference.
Oh, got it.
So it's not the climate change one that just finished, but it's the biodiversity one that's been, last year it was in Montreal. So we knew more about last year, this year it was in Colombia, so it's pretty far away.
What's Julian's expertise or role or?
He's on the committee here and he's like an environmental, what was it?
Consultant?
No, it's more like
Negotiated?
conflict resolution.
Mediator.
Kind of mediator, that's it, I think he's like a mediator.
He's on this committee.
No, I know he's on this committee, but like with an environmental mediator, but with an.
For environmental issues, they're not necessarily like he's coming at it as an environmentalist, it's more like,
Okay.
But
yeah. And
and he's
fluent
like
in Spanish, so I don't know what his role
Yeah.
there was. Do we know what his role there was? Was he a
I
translator?
kind of know, he was representing an indigenous group. Because one of the big things they had there was, who's got the right over all the
Right.
biodiversity data that's there?
Yeah.
I mean, you would think, well, just go take it, well, the indigenous groups are saying, look, we've stewarded this place for eons. Don't just come in here and study all this, discover new medicines and go, go get rich, well, maybe we gotta share this, that's how he
I see.
explained it to me.
Yeah.
So he's kind of getting in between I think he was representing the indigenous side in the discussions, trying to resolve that.
Okay.
So
Let's move on.
well, just for action, I think it would be good to, I think I'm hearing we should have this on the agenda next meeting.
Yes.
And we should, I'm willing to do it, contact Julian and say, there's a lot of interest in this, we want you to show up.
Okay, great. We're gonna move on to our next agenda item, which are revisions to MP2. And Ian's gonna report on what he's got going.
So, at our last meeting, well, a month ago, I said that I would pick up where Daniel left off with the revisions of the management plan. Daniel had sort of volunteered to work on the management plan instead of us recruiting an external person through an RFP, request for proposals. When we talked, I think briefly about it a month ago, it was agreed that we weren't ready to go out for with an RFP for an expert writer, that we had more work to do within the committee, and I would say foolishly volunteered to pick up and work on a revision of the management plan. And I didn't want to spend the rest of my life or whatever, however long that is, working on it. I set a deadline of 6 weeks, I think, to get it done, which means that I do intend to have something available for our next meeting. The 45 days or 6 weeks or a month and a half would take us to, I think, mid-December on our next meeting, or second week in December. Our next meeting is scheduled for the 16th. So I'm working hard on it. I'm spending too much time on this, but I'm optimistic. I think it's going to be great. And something that we can get our teeth into, or maybe really approve. I'm getting more and more enthusiastic about the potential outcome and the improvements that I believe we can make, and the clarifications and the updates and everything, which I'm working on. So in the packet, I put a document that has been my working document, sort of my checklist for the bits and pieces that I've, well, specifically the documents that we've already created over the last months and maybe years in this committee. And those are the items as written documents that I've been taking advantage of. So that's where it stands.
Great, well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ian.
Great.
Thank you, Ian.
Look forward to your progress at the next meeting. Okay,
Yell if you need her.
let's move on so we can get everything covered tonight. Next up is plans to name trails and signage, and I think Ian's going to speak about that.
Yeah, I put that one on also.
Okay.
There may be some misunderstanding, but I know that in the recognition, it's called the land recognition. I like to call it the land and people recognition. For those people who lived here before the Europeans showed up and made such a mess of the landscape by clear cutting and everything else. So in the specifics that's noted in that plan, which I know Cecilia worked on a lot, so it has more knowledge of it, but it includes one clear proposal is that trail names get maybe bilingual, so there's an English version and perhaps an Abenaki or some indigenous language translation, and that they be signed as such. I believe I see a trail that I think we should rename as Camel's Hump View or something similar like that. Because the present name, this Dana's Climb, isn't descriptive, and I don't think it's a useful name. We don't even seem to know exactly where that name came from. So I saw that as a specific opportunity to implement this plan, especially when I was reading Ethan Tapper's book, which everybody should read. And he gives, I believe it's an Abenaki name for Camel's Hump for the mountain. Going at the sitting place, and also a name that I don't remember and can probably pronounce, but that's what I saw as one possibility. In connection with that, from walking some of the paths and trails and roads recently, I've seen some really faded signs that need to be repaired or redone. And I know that in the management plan, signage is recognized as important. So I guess really I'm just wanting at this point sort of put this out there, the idea that we should be working on names and signage.
Yeah, if I could just add to that. First, I want to thank you for noticing and remembering that we had made a commitment when we adopted that sort of appendix, that we would making a commitment to helping to bring some of the Abenaki language back to the land. And Western Abenaki is considered by UNESCO in the highest category of endangered languages. And so any way that we can help, bring that language back to land is part of bringing the people and cultural practices. There's a lot of things we can do. When we were putting that together, it was another group, Richmond Racial Equity, reached out to all 4 tribes here, heard back from 2 of them, and worked with some language experts who came up with some proposals for naming trails. And at the time, they were suggesting naming them after animals. And because they said that would be normal traditionally for them to call a place by where they saw a specific animal or where they tend to hunt them, or, you know, where they're common. And they also felt that way they could have, it would be interesting for children. They would learn the names of something specific, like a variety of animals, and we could have signs that maybe we described in one place that this is a translation, but then all the signs wouldn't have to be bilingual. They could use the Abenaki name and a picture of the animal going forward. So they saw that as a great way to help return, again, the language to the land, and the feeling that their language and their understanding of the land and the way they would call them were also connected culturally. I think Ian's great. His book is great. I just saw him talk again at UVM and leafed through his book while he was doing that. I don't have a copy myself, even though it's in my research lab. The one thing I'm a little bit concerned is we should put that on the table and look into it, but I don't know where he got that from. And so we would want to obviously, you know, confirm with some experts in language. And I could see a camel's hump view could be explained one place, and then be pictures of camel's hump on the trail. You know, it would work with the whole animal concept as well. So I just wanted to add that, and just note for another day, it's actually kind of complex in Vermont now to work with Abenaki tribes because the legitimacy of the Vermont approved tribes have been contested by the Canadian tribes. And it's been a big issue. Who has the right to speak for Abenaki people? When we put this together and it was approved a couple of years ago now, that discussion hadn't evolved as much, but we just need to keep that in mind as we're thinking about how to incorporate Abenaki names, cultural practices, silvicultural practices, you know, and vegetation management into our work. Yes.
So I'm just wondering what the next part steps on that. So, how are we gonna decide which tribe we're going to consult with? And, you know, this name that Ethan came up with, how would we vet that? I mean,
Right.
I guess that's my question, is what would be our next step? Who would we look to and how would we decide that?
Yeah, a couple things. I mean, I can reach out to Ethan and say, where did you get that from, for one? Two, we did work with some people who are not claiming Abenaki citizenship, but are familiar with and consider themselves sort of culture keepers of the Abenaki language. We could go back to them, and they were among the people that contributed to that suggestion about how to name things.
And have their contact info and stuff.
Yeah, and I don't know what time frame we want to do this on. It would be nice to start seeing those names appear on our maps instead of Davis Klein. But it also sounds like from Tyler's discussion, we may be a ways out from actually having trails to put signs on.
Well, yeah.
Maybe the names could happen.
Yeah, I think that Ian's idea was to at least do the Janus Klein, maybe it's like a demonstration one, or to at least change the name of that trail and get it signed in the Abenaki language at this time. So I guess the next step would be you could reach out to.
Yeah, I can
Ethan
talk
and
to
where that came
Ethan.
from.
I know that as of 2 years ago, the Richmond Racial Equity Group were committed to working with Vermont tribes. They said they were approved by the state of Vermont. Those are the people we work with. We're not gonna let anybody else tell us. But now it's gotten, the conversation has evolved considerably since then. I being Klein, this is what neither tribe wants. Okay, so each group don't want you to talk to the other group. You're probably following this. And my normal thing would be, let's talk with everyone, and perhaps there's consensus on this one word that we can move forward with. But so even though they don't want us talking with each of the other groups, my inclination is to talk, there's an education museum center for the Odanak, Abenaki, just across the border in Quebec, I've been meaning to go to. Those, I think folks there we could consult with in terms of at least the language part. And there are people who are already in Vermont that we know that could help us with the Vermont perspective on the language.
There might be.
Have any disagreement on animal names between the two tribes?
Well,
That's
yes,
the
Campbell, I'm thinking about camels, who knows what was, that mountain was called, because there were no camels here.
Really?
Actually, a long time ago, there were megafauna camels. That might have been in North America, I can't remember, but that was a long time. So, yeah, short step is, next steps is, if people want, I can look into that, but I didn't want to dominate the conversation.
No, that would be great.
You know, even to find, you know, if there are parks where people have already done that, to get a sense of what the convention would be. You know, I mean, would it be? Okay, beaver, we might say, okay, beaver lookout. Well, they might not have. Did they have a word or a concept of lookout? You know, they might have.
That's why they were recommending, let's call this the beaver trail, and this will be the deer trail. And this will be the, you know, the fox trail. And it would be easy to make those
Something
signs.
trail, something
And
trail.
it's, yeah, and they had very much the educational piece in mind that, you know, children might wanna go and learn a word, and
Okay.
not, you know, be reinforced every time they see the sign.
The camel stump also called the crouching lion or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't
Yes.
called that at one point, it was called Camel Bluff.
Well, it depends on where you are, where you are told, you know, where you are, and whether it looks like a camel on the back of the camel.
So crouching line, if you're looking east to west versus, you know, west to east.
And who,
Yeah.
who.
It was Champlain, wasn't it?
I think it's Champlain.
Champlain.
Yeah, okay, we're gonna move on.
Can I just,
One last thing, yeah,
so do we have plans to talk about this next meeting then or something? Because
yeah.
and I still have questions about the process.
We
I
can,
don't need to take up the time now, though.
Yeah, so we have on our agenda, to add topics for next month, so.
Okay. I would love to talk about this a little bit more. I
Yeah,
think this
we
is great.
can, add this for next month's agenda.
Sure.
Okay, so, we're gonna move on, now to the Biofinder signups, and I think Sam, you were gonna speak about that.
Well, we have the expert in the room,
Okay.
so I would actually,
Alright.
for Jenna, if you wanna, I mean, I'm happy to share, but you are the authority on this.
Cut to the chase, because I
Go
think
for it.
there's a lot of confusion.
Yeah,
So we all know that it's on January 9th, and ideally, each of the 5 or 6 communities is sending 2 or 3 reps. All not totaling more than 20. The idea is that those reps, do their homework ahead of time, that's a requirement, which is to watch the 2 links that Ian should send to you. So that you can even be in a position of deciding whether you want to participate or not, because it's going to be a very interactive workshop. I don't know how interactive it's going to be because we have to do it on Zoom. There's apparently Biofinder moves very slowly when you get a lot of people in the same room on laptops. So unfortunately, it needs to be done on Zoom, but 2 or 3 of you would be in the position after you've done your homework and you've gone to this interactive workshop to provide a tutorial, which I'd like to set up with the library with a time designated space so that other folks who didn't go could go to the tutorial and sit side by side with you on their laptop and guide you through what we've learned. So that's the first part. The second thing to know is that it's ideal for your committee to come up with 2 or 3 specific questions of what you hope Biofinder will help you better understand about ACF. So what do you want to know specifically? Do you want to know more about likely wildlife movement corridors? And then if you, I'd like to gather all those questions, give them to Jens Hilke, who will be running this workshop. And he ahead of time will be able to do his homework and be in a better position during the interactive workshop show you very specifically how you can find what it is you hope to.
Is there a deadline on that request?
So we're saying December, we'd like to have, 2 or 3 members, you decide who's gonna go by December 15th.
Which
So
is the
we
day
have
before.
to send everybody those 2 links, so the story map and a video that gives you, but it's about 45 minutes long, that gives you an overview about what the Vermont Conservation Design is and what Biofinder is, and just some preliminary idea about how to use Biofinder, but it doesn't get into the meat and potatoes of how to really apply it. So the beauty of this workshop is that you'll be able to take it that one step further and then be in a position to train other people on your committee and how to use it.
Is there anybody, just off the top here that is interested in signing up?
Yeah. I'll be there.
Okay, we already have 3 people, and where is the sign up?
So I think if you, so the official way to sign up is to, send your names to Ian, and then Ian would send them to Judy. And she's keeping a tally.
So,
And-
I have 2 names, yeah.
and was there anyone else that was a quick draw, was there,
Yeah,
were there
well,
other people that were interested?
Yeah, no, I'm on RCC, so because I'm in both,
Okay.
it might be that I cannot count, like, I think
Okay,
a lot of folks from RCC might be going, and I don't know if we're gonna fill the 20 anyway, so.
okay,
So get your 2 or 3, and then Ian, you're gonna let Judy know who they are. And then in your next meeting, next December, put it on your agenda now, if you could, to talk about what are your questions. And so that might give you all of, a chance to see those links ahead of time and say, oh, it just seems to me that Biofinder would be really useful to show us X, Y, Z.
So Biofinder 4.0 is basically a computer program or a database or a set of maps. And that this workshop will
Yes.
teach you how to use that to answer, how to look for specific
It's
things.
it's a complicated map with many, many layers that are amazing and showing you detail. We found out that the amphibian crossing hotspots, most of them in Richmond have already been mapped. But we didn't know that, even though we started this amphibian program. But we can go to Biofinder and click through all the different layers and find out where they are now.
And so the people who get trained in this, they can then add to that map, that's the idea.
And that's the next level. So once you get comfortable, we're interested in mapping, when I say we, I mean the RCC. Invasives, where they are.
Yep.
What other things are you?
Oh, I was just curious how that map got developed. That's,
Yeah, is it like crowdsourced or is it approved by Jens that the data can now enter it? And when it says 20 people, is that meaning there's a special session just for Richmond or each town can be 20 people and they're?
No, this is something that is kind of an unusual ask of Jens, who's working for the state. So it's 20 people for our town, and the reason he limited it to 20 is because he's gonna have to have 2 breakout rooms. He may have to manage both of those on his own.
Okay.
He wants to be able to more specifically answer your questions and interact with you if you're having some difficulties. Kit has done a training, do you wanna say anything about it?
I just, well, I thought it's gonna be a very useful tool. I just think it's the fact that he's gonna have to look at 2 different rooms, be in 2 different rooms, I think will be difficult, but yeah, I think, the fact that it's on Zoom maybe will be better too, I think.
So it's only for the state, it's
So
only for Richmond.
when you watch the 4.0 link that Ian will send you, many people walk away after that and they still don't know how to use Biofinder. And so what he recommends commonly is just get on Biofinder and play around with it. So if you could do that too. But a lot of folks don't find it very intuitive. And then they would like a little more guidance from him about how to more specifically, because for instance, if you're turning on the layers about the interior forest blocks, it's really hard to actually see the layer that shows you where rare, threatened and endangered species have been located. So you have to kind of click that off. You can see the, places where they, mapped.
Okay.
So I'd really
We-
recommend people look at the documents in the packet, which came from the Conservation Commission. And it lets us know what we're getting into. It gives the links to the homework. That's a fairly substantial commitment to go through the 2 links there. The video is about an hour long. But as Jeanette's pointed out, this is Biofinder goes along with Vermont Conservation Design, which is something that I believe we need to take really seriously. And the Conservation Commission people can help us do that. This is a state agency that has developed a plan for exactly the kind of situation we're in. So, you know, this is my.
Yeah, and this is nicely to the biodiversity conversation you want to have, because Vermont Conservation Design is really Vermont's attempt to meet 30 by 30 and 50 by 50 to prevent biodiversity crashing.
Okay, well, great. Thank you so much for the update on that. And it sounds like signups will be coming via Ian. So thank you. Yeah, so we have one more thing to tackle here, which is the town report, which needs to be written before.
Again, I put this one on the agenda because in looking at last year's and previous time reports, I noticed that our committee, the Ambrose Committee, hasn't put a report in, and I spoke briefly with Linda Parent, and I said, why, we don't have a report in recent town reports. We don't have an entry from this committee. Should we? And she said, absolutely, yes. And I said, remind me the deadline. And it's typically early January, late December, early January. And so I believe actually we're in pretty good shape to write some 1 page or at most. In part because of the material I put together for my little speech last year, saying, look, we've been trying to document what this committee has been doing. So that's, I believe, is a good basis for doing it. So somebody should pull the information together and have it ready to submit to the town report. That's my recommendation.
Would you be willing to do it since you have those things all together?
I thought that might happen.
Just asking.
Yeah, I can do it, and it will be. So I should have a draft by our next meeting, December 16th.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, and then we just, we talked earlier about some items that we want to have on next month's agenda. Is there anything else that people would like to have included next month? No, all right, great. Well, is there any last comment before we have entertain a motion to adjourn?
I have a random, maybe weird question. It seems like Ethan Tapper is everybody respects and likes him. Now that he is no longer the county forester, could we work with him professionally? Would that be appropriate, you think, as the?
We can, the county forester comes for free if it's the
Yeah.
county forester. And Ethan is a pay-as-you-go forester now.
Thinking back to what you were talking about with feeling like we were maybe in need of professional help with, steering the committee towards something that we all want to say, whether that's recreation or conservation, everything in between. I wonder if Ethan could be someone who could help with that. I don't know if that would fit his skill set or if he'd be willing or. If it was
Yeah, he
appropriate.
does have a professional forester hat that he contracts out, with some folks that, right now, some people he's working with. I've nudged him in the past to ask him to help us with how do we balance the multiple uses? And he did not want to touch, particularly the topic of mountain biking, the 20-foot pole. He said that's just not something I'm gonna weigh in on. He was happy early on, he used to come to all of our meetings, actually, very early on, or many of the meetings.
Cecile, you think that was because of his job then? Now that he's free of that, maybe he wouldn't worry about you know, going against a, you know, state policy or something.
Well, I think the real issue is what does he charge per hour and
Mhm.
we get approved
And
for.
what we want him to do, and he's sort of on a book tour right now. I could ask him.
Well, we have resources, and we can go to the Conservation Reserve Fund.
Yeah.
If we had a plan and he was the logical person to help us with, I mean, not a development plan, but a plan for what this person would do.
I asked him what it would cost for him to go through the update, the forestry plan. And it was, now I can't remember the numbers, but it was like $150 or $300. And I mentioned it to Josh, and Josh kind of went, you know, no sweat, I mean, that's not big money. So,
You mean per hour,
Per hour.
no, that was his total, I think he was figuring,
$150.
not even.
That was per hour, trust me.
No, because he said, no, it wasn't, because he said, if I just do it and bring it to the meeting, it will be like 150. If I have to, you know, like dick around with it some more, it's gonna be 300. So that wasn't his hourly.
He does, yeah, he's used to being paid by the state.
Yeah.
Maybe that.
Okay, well, we've
Well, we
reached,
could ask him, you know, just for that very specifically, updating the forest plan, the
Yeah.
forestry plan.
Yeah.
That might be a very, because he
Right.
wrote it.
Brendan may have already done that, so I don't know. That's what he's waiting to tell us about next month.
He's the county forester?
He's in the, Benedict.
Gotcha.
all right, it's 8 o'clock, it's a little past 8. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
I'll second.
All right, excellent. Thank you, everyone. Our next meeting is slated for December 16th.